Welcome to the Vashon Heritage Museum's first museum talk of 2022. Tonight's talk is about Captain Vancouver's first contact with Vashon Island. I'm Elsa Kernquist, Executive Director of the Heritage Museum. I'd like to give you a reminder that your microphone is muted for this talk. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat function and we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. I'd like to recognize and thank For Culture at this time for sponsoring this museum talk series. I'd like to introduce Chris Austin, who is a Heritage Museum board member, co-host of this museum talk, and host of our radio show, History Worth Hearing. Chris will acknowledge the first Vashon Native people and read the land acknowledgement statement. Chris?
Thank you, Elsa. Before I do the land acknowledgement, I'd like to talk a bit about the woman that's on the screen. Her name is Lucy Duran, and she's a very important figure in the history of our islands. She was born on Vashon about 1843. As a young woman, she attended the 1854 Medicine Creek Treaty Assembly. That included all Native people from Vashon Island in the north to Squaxin Island and Olympia in the south. Later in her life, in a testimony in 1927 at the Land Claims Tribunal, she provided the most complete information that we have on the Shwabop's Native people on Vashon. She died on Vashon, January 7th, 1929. She was buried in the Vashon Cemetery, but her grave was unmarked until 2008, when a headstone was placed on her grave in a ceremony that included the Puyallup tribe of Indians and Islanders. Next slide, please. We acknowledge and recognize that we are on the ancestral lands and traditional home of the Shwabop's Coast Salish Native people, the first people of Vashon Island. This land was their home long before Euro-American voyagers and settlers arrived. The Shwabops were forcibly removed from these lands and relocated onto neighboring reservations, including Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot. Vashon Island is their traditional home, and their historical relationship with the land continues today. We honor the island itself and the Shwabop's people, past and present.
Thank you, Chris. And now I'd like to read the Inclusion Pledge, Vashon Heritage Museum's Inclusion Pledge. Next slide, please. The Vashon Maury Island Heritage Museum rejects racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience, stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of cultures and histories. Next slide, please. So join us next month in February as we present the Vashon Poet Laureates, the importance of poetry in the life of a small community. Anne Spears as the first Vashon Poet Laureate and Sandra Noel as the current Vashon Poet Laureate will provide a perspective on poetry on the island, how it has developed and changed over the years, and how it has again come to play an increasingly visible and important role in our community. And then in March, join us when speakers from the Audubon Society will join us to talk about the birds of Vashon as part of our exhibit, Natural Wonder, an island shaped by water, which is showing at the museum right now. Next slide, please. Tonight's speaker. Cyrus Anderson is a retired certified financial planner, past board member of a nonprofit counseling agency, and is currently a board member and serving a third term as the treasurer of the Vashon Heritage Museum. He is an active and dedicated docent and public speaker with focused research on the history of Vashon Island, the Maury Island incident, and the voyages of Captain George Vancouver. Tonight, Cyrus presents his talk from the perspective of Captain George Vancouver and Lieutenant Peter Puget of the British Royal Navy. as they mapped the Salish Sea and eventually made first contact with Vashon and Maury Islands. Cyrus, thank you for being here.
Well, welcome to this telling of the story of the earliest Euro-American presence in the Pacific Northwest. The story of the 1792 British naval expedition of Captain George Vancouver and Lieutenant Peter Puget, who were the first Westerners to see, explore, and map the Puget Sound and Vashon Island, and to have first contact with the indigenous peoples of our area here. I want to send out thanks to my friend and colleague, Dr. Bruce Hallman, who has given me able assistance in the putting together of this program, and to Richard Blumenthal, who has combined all of the existing known personal logs and journals of the British naval officers and enlisted on the Vancouver expedition. These logs and journals are the main sources for my research for this talk, which raises an important consideration. The Heritage Museum acknowledges the Squabops people, first peoples of Vashon Maury Island, who've been here for some 6,000 years before first contact by Euro-American explorers, and recognizes the tragic history of those people that unfolded from Western settlement in our home area. As we consider and share thoughts and observations of the members of the Vancouver expedition, it's important to remember that, as Winston Churchill reputedly said, history is written by the victors. The materials in the British logs and journals reflect their own perceptions, perspectives, understandings, and their misunderstandings and even their prejudices of men of their own time and cultures. We hear their story, but what we don't get is the other side of the story, that of the native peoples themselves and how they experienced and interpreted these same events through their eyes and ears, with cultures so very different from that of the Western explorers. It is only in more recent times that we're coming to better understand those people back then, and also their descendants living as our neighbors with us now. As we hear Vancouver expedition story unfold, it's important to remember that native peoples themselves may have seen and interpreted these same events very differently than British naval personnel of late 18th century colonial industrial developing England. With those thoughts in mind, then, let us begin. The Salish Sea and the northwest coast of North America were among the last areas in North America to be explored and mapped, with the exception of the extreme Arctic area. The presence and this area was made best known by Captain James Cook. Captain Cook was the last of the great era of explorers to combine 3 different trips around the Pacific Ocean. And on his 3rd trip, when he had on board a young man by the name of George Vancouver, he put into our area here in the Pacific Northwest. He landed at Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island on March 29th, 1778. Cook arrived in his ship, the Resolution, and he was looking for the Northwest Passage. The Admiralty of England had put out a 20,000 pound reward, and 20,000 pounds was a lot of money in those days for whomever it was who would find and be able to explore at least the entrance to the Northwest Passage. Well, Captain Cook didn't find the Northwest Passage, but what instead he found were huge colonies of sea otters, who have among the most luxuriant fur of any mammal in the world. And they recognized immediately the commercial possibilities of this huge resource and being able to sell hides, especially in China. When they got back to England, though Captain Cook was not with them because he was massacred, as it was, in 1779 on the big island of Hawaii in Kealakekua Bay. But as his crews returned to England and word got out, it set off something of a fur gold rush. And by 1885, a number of British entrepreneurs had made their way to Vancouver Island to work with the Indians and set up trade arrangements with them, that they would be then provide the hides and they would be paid for those by various kinds of means. He had with him well, excuse me. However, all of this motion up here did not pass the notice of the Spanish. The Spanish had been in the Pacific Ocean since very shortly after Christopher Columbus. And in 1513, Balboa crossed the Panama Isthmus and declared the entire Pacific Ocean as now being property of Spain. They immediately went about establishing trade routes to the Far East and especially Manila in the 15 and 1600s, and were well established there. But they did not come north. It was just too remote. It was still terra incognita, even though it was part of their assumed bailiwick of the entire Pacific Ocean. But when they started hearing about the British coming to Vancouver Island and working with the natives, and when they heard about the Russians coming across the Aleutian Islands and having pretty much wiped out the northern fur seal population on the way and were working their way down the Alaskan coast, that and the British, and both the British and the Americans were coming around Cape Horn and up the west coast of South America and North America to all converge in this area around Vancouver Island to follow the fur trade, they got very, very nervous about the safety and security and proprietary ownership of their claim of the entire Pacific Ocean, and in this case, the Pacific Northwest. And so they sent a fleet of ships to go to Nootka Sound and to confiscate British ships that were there and confiscate other property and declare that it all was the property of Spain, and to establish a colony on Vancouver Island. Well, this set off what became known as the Nootka controversy. What happened was that when Parliament learned about this, Parliament declared war on Spain. Spain and Britain have a long history of naval warfare together, and so this was no small stuff. Spain looked around for allies in this war, and the only people they could go to were the French, but the French were right in the middle of the French Revolution, and so they weren't going to be very much help. So Spain looked at its coal card and decided that the hand did not play, and they capitulated. And the result was the Treaty of Nootka in 1790. However, the Spanish were still in the area, and once that treaty was written and they could see the writing on the wall, they determined that they needed to do as much exploration and establish as much presence in the Pacific Northwest as the British might. And with 4 different expeditions from 1789 right up until the last expedition, while Captain Vancouver was right there with them, they very thoroughly explored and mapped the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and then into what is now the American and Canadian San Juans, the reason that the San Juans all have Spanish names. And on the third of these expeditions, on their way out and sailing along the Washington coast at this time, they came to the area around Port Townsend, where the entrance to what Vancouver named as Admiralty Inlet lay there, but they did not turn down into it. In fact, they looked into it and thought it was just a big bay. They determined that they did not have enough rations and stores to be taking off into unknown ground, because they were trying to continue the mapping of the areas that the first two expeditions had already been into. And so they thought that maybe when they came back, they would look down in there and see what was going on. But they came back in the fall, and by then the winds were already coming off the Pacific Ocean and blowing down the Strait of Juan de Fuca, creating what we now call as the convergence zone in the Everett area. And in their sailing ships, the winds were so brisk that their concern was they would not be able to sail against the wind and get out of the Strait of Juan de Fuca before winter set in. So they decided to skip that area, never turned down in there and looked what might be down there, and instead returned to Nootka Sound. The exploration then of what was to become Admiralty Inlet was left to Captain George Vancouver. Vancouver had been a young midshipman on Captain Cook's voyages and was already familiar with the area. He was a very experienced captain and had spent time in the Caribbean, had already been in the Pacific Northwest with Cook, and he was selected to lead an expedition to the Pacific Northwest and to the area of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. His orders were to assert British presence, to very thoroughly survey and map the area, and to be looking for the fabled Northwest Passage, the same thing that Captain Cook had been looking for, and to negotiate then the Nootka Treaty details and to possess the lands for England. And they also were given specific instructions not to antagonize the native peoples in the area, but to do everything they could to create good relationships with them. Vancouver arrived in the end of April of 1792 in his two ships, Discovery, about 100 feet long with about 100 sailors on it, and Chatham, a two-masted schooner with 50 personnel aboard, about 80 feet long. And each of these ships had at least 3 small boats that were to be used in the surveying activities and for any other purposes that the ships might have. Along with him were Joseph Whidbey, who was an expert surveyor and map maker, and Lieutenant Joseph Baker, and Lieutenant Peter Puget, for whom we do not have a picture. These were the days that were called the days of ships of wood and men of steel. Life aboard a British naval ship was very, very rigorous. If you have seen the excellent Russell Crowe movie, Master and Commander, you get a good idea of what life was actually like on a sailing ship of that particular era. Happen to know that movie's been on television recently, and for those of you who are theater buffs, it's a wonderful film and gives you something of an idea and a feel for what it must have been like to be doing this. Their primary task would be surveying, and everywhere they would go in the Salish Sea area, they would be taking surveying lines of sight and laying out triangulations for the eventual map preparation of the Salish Sea. But they also encountered native peoples and remembered their orders that they were to not antagonize the native peoples, but instead to do what they could to create good relationships with them. The boats were used for a bunch of different kinds of reasons. One of the primary ones was securing food. After all, they had 153 people to be feeding. And so small boat crews, every time they put down anchor, were sent on land to hunt. They also were in constant need of fresh water. So boats were all the time ferrying in with barrels and finding small creeks to secure fresh water for the ship. There was also endless maintenance to be done. The ships, after all, had been at sea for many months and had a lot of wear and tear. They'd broken some sail spars, and there was a need to be able to settle in someplace for a while to enable this kind of work to be done. They also went about brewing spruce beer. Scurvy was the issue, and it had been a plague on mariners for time immemorial. It was the French who discovered that eating green leaf matter may be able to stave off scurvy, and they found out that the best kinds of green matter to be consuming were the needles of conifer trees like the spruce and fir. And so they had these big kettles that they were constantly brewing up this spruce beer, at times with a little grog added. Grog was a very important part of life in the British Navy. And they also were always needing to keep their powder dry, as the old saying goes, and it comes from people like this who had armed ships in wet and damp climates, and so there was a constant effort to be keeping powder dry. They also encountered native peoples. These native peoples would come out to the ships and trade with them there. Meeting the native peoples, however, was a very interesting experience, and their logs and journals are full of descriptions of the native peoples and their habits and their clothing and what they ate and where they lived. They were especially taken by the peoples in the Salish areas by the conical hats that they wove. The people of higher stature would have very ornate hats, but even the most modest worker had cone-shaped hats. And in fact, some of the tribes practice flattening and narrowing the heads of children to create kind of a cone-shaped head, which the Vancouver expedition people remarked on in many places, that these conical hats would set right down on them. They also found that the people were very welcoming, which was a real surprise because, of course, they had the intelligence from the British Navy and knew there had been some violent and deadly incidents in the past between some Spanish ships and some of the early fur traders. And they had also met up with Captain Robert Gray, an American who was sailing in those waters, which is a whole nother very interesting story. But Robert Gray had had a frightening and perilous experience on Vancouver Island, where he almost had his ship commandeered by the native peoples in that area. And it led to some very difficult confrontation with people there. And so Vancouver's expedition and all of the people involved were very wary, wondering whether or not when they met the native peoples, there might be hostility. But they were pleasantly surprised to find that instead the people were friendly and respectful and polite, cheerful, and very, very open to them. And they were most interested in trade. They were constantly coming up to the British ships whenever the ships were available, wanting to trade pelts, animal pelts, and food. They became a major supplier of food, actually, for the entire expedition, in return for pieces of copper and iron and different kinds of trinkets and buttons, because they wanted them for their costuming. The native peoples had a wide variety of dressing modes, and the most elaborate of them involved a lot of jewelry made out of whatever they could find, and they were very, very desirous of these metal treatments to be able to build their own costume jewelry with. They were also often wore very brilliant face paint, full face paint in white, ochre, and black. And they were frightening and intimidating, but an interesting comment in one of the journals was that one of the officers went up and took a very close look at the face painting on one of the native peoples and decided it wasn't much more painting than you find on fashionable London and Paris ladies of the day. They also came through many villages along their way, and they were amazed at the architecture and building prowess of these people who did not even have any kind of metal tools like the British, and did all of this with stone tools and antler tools. They were able to somehow split off thick planks, inch or two thick, from long cedar boards and build them into these shed type structures, some of these structures very long and very large. And they were surprised to learn that these sheds could often be dismantled and moved, which they encountered at one point later on in their cruise. They came across a tribe that was moving one of these big houses with pieces of this lumber in the canoes. And everywhere they found villages, they also found canoes. Canoes were the most prized possession of the Salish people. They built amazing dugout canoes, and the British could hardly believe the fine craftsmanship that was involved. The canoes themselves were sometimes ornately decorated, and they built canoes, everything from short punts that would hold perhaps one person or two with snub noses, to long, elegant, and beautifully decorated canoes that could hold up to 30 people for whatever purposes they might want to do that. They also came across a lot of strikingly interesting art in these lodges, art that has come down to us in a representative form that we still recognize today. And you can go down to Raven here on Vashon and see Mr. Shotridge's work, which is very similar to the kinds of stunning and very distinctive art form that these people had. One of the most interesting and strange things they came across was the dogs. They found that in virtually every village they visited were large packs of dogs. And I don't mean a few dogs, I mean dozens and dozens and dozens of dogs. It turns out that the Salish people bred their own strain of dogs, which was a common practice among American native tribes who bred dogs for their own purposes. And the Salish people bred a dog that looks like something between a Bichon and a husky. It was a somewhat smaller dog. And what they did was they used the dogs like sheep, and they sheared the sheep and they turned it into a yarn. And with it, they wove exquisite blankets and clothing. The British were continually amazed at the quality and the beauty of some of the clothing, and especially the blankets that they saw. They also came across a very interesting phenomenon, very tall poles that were supported. These poles sometimes were joined together with expert carpentry and were up to 90 feet tall, if you can imagine that. And the poles were often arranged in long lines, couple hundred feet apart. The longest train of these they saw was 17 of these poles covering almost a quarter mile. And they couldn't imagine what these poles must be for. Well, it turns out that these poles were the way that the native peoples were able to capture ducks and geese. They wove huge nets and were able to run them up these poles and stretch them across from pole to pole. And they would do this right along the beach facing the ocean, and in areas where behind the beach there were swampy areas, for instance, where there were gathered thousands and thousands and thousands of seabirds. They would then go out and startle the birds being seabirds would all rise up off the water and head for the ocean, which is what seabirds do, and fly right into these nets. and the native peoples were able to snag hundreds of ducks and geese at a time, and they were one of the major food trade items that the natives used when dealing with the English. There were poles like this found on Vashon Island right at Portage when Charles Wilkes' expedition some 50 years later would survey Vashon Island more accurately. They also came across very distinctive burial areas. If you were a wealthy or well-to-do enough person to own your own canoe, it was kind of like the Vikings who, when a prominent person deceased, they were put in their Viking ship and sent out to sea. Here, they were put in their canoe. They were wrapped in these blankets. Their planks were placed over them. And at both ends, they were then raised up and hung from high branches in trees. They also found baskets full of the skeletal remains of children, sometimes even infants, and those also raised up in the air, presumably to dissuade animals from disturbing these burial sites. But they also found something that was very disturbing. In a number of locations, they came across large abandoned villages. The buildings were still there, but were run down. And in the grasses and in the area around these villages, they found human bones and skulls strewn just all over the place. One of the abandoned villages they found had a large fire pit, and there were human bones and skulls there. And they wondered what possibly could have happened that would lead to this kind of seemingly wanton death. And they wondered whether or not it was perhaps warfare, because there was a history of warfare between the northern and southern tribes in the Salish Sea, or whether it might be some kind of disease. Well, that was what things turned out to be. And later researchers were able to determine that starting in the 1770s, probably with an initial contact with a Spanish ship that was there even 4 years before Captain Cook, but really never went ashore, that somehow smallpox got transferred to native residents, and then it spread like wildfire through their trading relations. Scholars estimate that by the time Vancouver got there, smallpox had probably killed 20 to 30,000 people in the Salish Sea area. And researchers know that in our own people, the Schwabops people of Vashon Island, between 1774 and 1862, only about 90 years, over 95% of the Schwabops were killed by diseases that had been introduced by European forces. In the midst of all this darkness, however, there was light. It was the landscape. These were people who had traveled all around the world, and over in their journals and notes, they marvel at the scenery and at the landscape of the Salish Sea. Imagine what it must have been like to have come into the Salish Sea before there was any Western presence or development at all. Crystal clear waters teeming with fish, millions of birds, tall trees, 100 to 200 feet high, coming right down to the waterline. These magnificent snow-covered mountains in the background. It was more than anyone had ever seen before. And their journals are full of remarks about the beauty of the area. Vancouver himself exclaimed, "The country before us exhibited every bounty of nature that could be expected to draw into one point of view. I could not possibly believe that any uncultivated country had ever been discovered exhibiting so rich a picture. Some of the descriptions of the landscape border on poetry. One of my favorites is by Archibald Menzies, who was the expedition surgeon and botanist and scientist. And he filled his notebooks with descriptions of flowers and plants. Remember, this is right at the end of June, near the end of June, and end of May, and everything was in full bloom throughout the whole Salish Sea area, and it was just stunning. Archibald Menzies, who, by the way, named the Arbutus menzies, the very madrona tree that we have on this island, writes these flowery description. He says, a traveler wandering over these unfrequented plains is regaled with a salubrious and vivifying air impregnated with the balsamic fragrance of the surrounding pinery. While his mind is eagerly occupied every moment on new objects, his senses are riveted on the variety of the surrounding scenery, where the softer beauties of landscape are harmoniously blended in majestic grandeur with the wild and romantic, to form a picturesque prospect on every side. One of my favorites was by Thomas Manley, who was the chronicler of the expedition. Manley writes this: distant mountains reared their stupendous heads capped with eternal snow and embellished the scene past all description. It had more the aspect of enchantment than reality. With silent admiration, each man discerned the beauties of nature, and naught was heard on board but expressions of delight murmured from every tongue. The actual expedition itself into what Captain Vancouver named Admiralty Inlet, and which had been overlooked by the Spanish so that they never went there, started right in what is now the Port Townsend area, which was named by Captain Cook, or excuse me, Captain Vancouver, for one of his friends in the British Navy. They'd spent 2 weeks there repairing the ship, doing a lot of maintenance work, doing a lot of surveying. Remember that everywhere they went, they were constantly surveying and shooting lines of sight and taking sightings to determine longitude and latitude, to be able to prepare eventually the maps that they were their first and primary duty in the area. They spent time in that area, and then they dropped down into Admiralty Inlet to where Hood's Canal separates from the main stem of Admiralty Inlet, and they anchored their ships there, and then by rowboats rowed the entire length of Hood Canal down to the elbow. It was almost like a kind of Twilight Zone experience. They said that excuse me here, that it was all silent and very eerie, and they didn't see animals and they didn't see people, and they wondered what was happening, and they got all the way down to the bottom of Hood's Canal, and they came across a hunting camp, one of the first hunting camps that they'd experienced, a large hunting camp. The women were all drying clams and oysters, and once they were dried, they would thread them on a cord made out of fibrous material, and then they put the cord around your neck, and you have your lunch with you, and you can pick off an oyster or a clam and pop it in your mouth as you're moving about. The men, the hunters, were all completely naked, and they found this to be true throughout the Salish Sea, that the men hunted naked, whereas the women covered up at least below their waists. These same people had clothing that when they were in that kind of a circumstance, they would wear clothing, but for their hunting trips, they hunted naked. Then on May 19th of 1792, they moved down and anchored the ship between Blake Island and the southeast corner of Bainbridge Island and named it Restoration Point. And that very day, Vancouver drew up a set of orders for Lieutenant Peter Puget and for Joseph Whidbey, the surveyor, to take 2 boats, one with 10 oarsmen, 5 on a side, and one with 6 oarsmen, 3 on a side, and all of the surveying equipment and camping gear and provisions and rations for 7 days. And they were to keep to the right, having the land always on the right, and drop down into what we now call Culvus Passage to go down and determine where all of this went and just how far this body of water extended. This map can be found at Memorial Park in Stellicum, overlooking the ferry depot there and overlooking the site of where the Puget expedition actually took place. They left Restoration Point at 4 a.m. on May 20th and worked their way down Vashon. About the only description that was ever given until Vancouver named the island was that it was a place, a wilderness of lofty trees and impenetrable underbrush. They swept down through the currents along Vashon. They stopped into Olalla for a meal, moved on, and then eventually found themselves in the Tacoma Narrows and the powerful currents through there, 7 to 8 knots, pushing them along, pulling them along, or pushing them in this case, so fast that they were afraid they wouldn't even be able to get their boats out of the water. But they were able to finally maneuver them out at about where Point Fosdick is now in the entrance to Hale Passage. And they noticed that all along, since they had left this island, yet to be named Vashon, that they were being shadowed by a native in a canoe who was keeping close tabs on them, but staying far enough away. After all, these people had never seen Europeans before, nor had they ever seen their boats before. And he was real interested in who these people were and what they were doing. He rowed around them up and went up into Walachet Bay, which means squirting clams. And so when lunch was done, the Puget party got back in their boats and they rowed up into Walachet Bay. And at first it didn't seem like anybody was there. And then they realized that there was a village kind of back in the woods, and that the women and children, when they saw these strangers and boats, all scurried off into hiding, but a few of the men stayed out to see what was going on. There was no trading that was being done at that time. And so the Puget expedition left Walachet Bay and rowed their way up to what is now called Shaw's Cove. They set up where they would be staying the night. They went around the point and went up to what is now Cutts Island, a place where they found huge flocks of crows, so thick that they thought they'd probably be able to take crows with their muskets, which they did. And so in a very real sense, they ate crow, which turned out to actually be pretty good. And Puget himself was very pleased because he was able to supplement their stores and rations. The next day, they finished rowing up all the way up to the end of Carr Inlet and found what they found on all inlets, and that was that the inlets all ended in mud flats, and worked their way back down to what is now Van Geldern Cove and the little village of Home, when they experienced perhaps the most frightening and dangerous event on the entire Vancouver expedition tour. They were confronted, they had pulled ashore and were beginning to lay out nets to catch fish when they were confronted by a large group in a number of canoes of heavily armed native peoples with real hostile intents. And they didn't know what to make of it because they hadn't ever experienced hostility from the natives yet, and wondered what the problem was. Eventually, before it turned to dangerous bloodshed, things were able to calm down, and whatever the issue was, which Puget himself never quite figured out, was resolved, at least in the mind of the native peoples. And the Puget party got back in their boats and left. They were followed for a little bit, for a while. It's a great story. It'd be a great story to tell sometime, but we don't have the time to tell it now. But the whole thing was so alarming that they named it Alarm Cove. They then the next day went down through McNeil and Anderson Islands and out to Ketron Island, and then went over to Anderson Island and camped out the night there. The next day they rode down into Nisqually and all the way up through the open waters in that part of the South Sound to the very top of Case Inlet. And then over the next few days, they worked their way down, keeping always the land on the right, down around Harstein Island, Squaxin Island. They entered several of the big inlets at the south end of the South Sound, and they had a number of encounters with native people and a very friendly and interesting encounter near in Bud Inlet, in Eld Inlet, where they were invited to a big celebration and feast. And there are wonderful expressions, descriptions of what all went on at this feast. The next day they looked out and they realized that they had already been through these waters before, and that in fact they had now circumnavigated the entire sound. And it happened to be the 7th day, and they had their orders were to return on the 7th day. And so they loaded up and deadheaded for home. On the way up, passing Ketron Island on the right, they saw smoke coming up from the trees and wondered whether or not it might be Indian. But they continued on through, were swept through the Tacoma Narrows and up what would eventually be called Colville's Passage, and arrived about 1 in the morning where the ship was anchored up off Restoration Point, only to learn that 2 days before that, Captain Vancouver and Lieutenant Johnstone took 2 boats and crews and went to explore not the keeping to the right, but the keeping to the left of the large body of water that they were anchored in. They crossed over to the 3T Point area, and remember, they're also surveying at every point and location where they can draw lines to be pulling together the eventual map. And they worked their way down to a place between Dash Point and Browns Point. And there they got out for lunch and had another encounter with the native peoples, which started out well, but then threatened to turn real bad. But yet that also was peacefully ended. And they ended up having a meal together. And it was an aha kind of epiphany for Vancouver, because he realized that these people were not the primitives that he had feared they might be, and in fact were sophisticated people of excellent values, and he was very impressed by that. He went around what is now Commencement Bay, hoping that they were going to be able to find the Northwest Passage. They could see Mount Rainier, and they could see what we now call Vancouver's Notch, which is actually the confluence of the Moich and Puyallup rivers. But you can see it looking out, anytime you look out towards Mount Rainier to the south, this dramatic notch. And they thought maybe that was it. Maybe that was the way to the Northwest Passage. But the Indians assured him that that was not the case. He continued along Ruston Way, around Point Defiance, and down through the Tacoma Narrows, swept down all the way down to Ketron Island. And while they stopped there and camped that night, and while it was still light, they had looked out over the water and they could see way out there 2 tiny little boats, but they were so far away they weren't able to identify them, and just assumed that they were probably native canoes. Well, it turns out they weren't native canoes. They were the Puget party returning to Restoration Point, but they weren't able to, they didn't realize that at the time. Meanwhile, the Puget party saw smoke coming up from Ketron Island and thought it was natives there. And it turned out Vancouver was looking at Puget and Puget was looking at Vancouver. And they didn't even know that until they all got back together and formed back up at Restoration Point. The lower part of the expedition having been finished, they got together, they got their minds together, looked at all of the surveying and shooting of angles works that both Vashon, or excuse me, both the Puget party and the Vancouver party had, and determined that they pretty much had the information they needed to draw the first map of the area. And what you see then is part of the 1792 map that was put together as a result of all of the surveying that was done on the Vancouver expedition. You can see that it's slightly different than the map that we have now. The map we have now really didn't come together until 1841 in the Charles Wilkes expedition, which itself is another interesting story to be told. And you can see that there are some little areas and that they didn't really pick some things up, but nevertheless, they got pretty close to it. They then pulled together everything and determined then to be leaving the lower Puget Sound. And on the way out, Vancouver writes in his log, "The land composing the eastern shore of this channel and the western shore of what we had pursued on Saturday morning was now ascertained to be the most extensive island we had yet met with in our several examinations of this coast, which after my friend Captain Vashon of the British Navy, I gave the distinguished name of Vashon's Island. And to commemorate Mr. Puget's exertions, the south extremity, meaning the area south of the Tacoma Narrows, I named Puget's Sound." The party continued then up, explored the area of now what is Elliott Bay in the Seattle area, worked their way up to the Everett area, and at Tulalip Bay, just north of Everett, they went ashore on King George III's birthday, the same King George of the American Revolution, to celebrate his birthday and to take possession of the land in the name of Great Britain. They renamed it New Georgia, and their understanding of that land extended all the way, if you can imagine this, to Point Arena in California, which is about halfway between San Francisco Bay and the Southern Oregon border. Took possession of the area and then continued on north, did extensive surveying in the eastern portion of what is now the San Juan Islands, and continued up through Bellingham Bay, Birch Bay. And while they were up there, they encountered the last two ships of the last of the four Spanish expeditions. The two ships, the captains of the ships got together. They were kind of wary of each other. After all, the Nootka Treaty had not yet really been fleshed out yet, but they determined and they shared their maps with each other, which I thought was very interesting, and determined that they had pretty much covered all the bases and that probably the best and most secure thing for both of the expedition groups were to sail together. And what they did was go all the way then up the Strait of Georgia and through the pass out around the top of Vancouver Island and ended up back down then in Nootka. Vancouver, of course, was supposed to be finishing all the details of the Nootka Treaty. That didn't go well. And eventually the parties split up. William Broughton, who was captain of the smaller of the two ships, the Chatham, went south, and he actually entered the Columbia River and extended his sailing quite a ways up there. Vancouver himself was to go on north to Alaska and the Aleutians and spent the next 2 seasons still in the North Pacific, wintering each year in Hawaii. And there are some wonderful stories about Captain Vancouver's interactions with Kamehameha, the first king of the consolidated Hawaiian Islands. And Vancouver himself was instrumental in what became ultimately, because of 2 cattle that he gave to Kamehameha, eventually became the largest cattle ranch in the United States, Parker Ranch near Kailua on the big island of Hawaii. Vancouver eventually, after 2 more years, returned to England and spent the next 3 years with the help of Peter Puget, putting together all of his journals and notes and finishing all of the maps of all of the territory, because remember, they were surveying all the way along all the time. And he died at age 44. Peter Puget himself became eventually an admiral in His Majesty's Navy. The impact of the expedition was to create the maps, map the area. So they had the first understanding of what the Salish Sea really looked like, and to establish British presence in the area and to basically force the Spanish out. The Spanish in short order retreated to below Point Arena in Alta California, never to return to this area. The stage was set for the eventual settlement in the area. Vancouver's work was used with the establishing of the Oregon Territory and the Treaty of 1818, and surveying, and his work was also used all the way up in 1846 with the Treaty of Oregon, where they established the final boundary between Canada and the United States. As they left and in conversation with each other, they were talking about the whole area that they'd seen and what an astounding place it was. There were a couple navotes who believed that even though it was a wonderful place and deep water ports, many people don't know how deep Puget Sound is. The waters off Vashon Island are over 600 feet deep. The waters off Elliott Bay are 1,000 feet. And all of that was part of the process. And Joseph Baker, in speaking about what great port country and everything this was, didn't think it would work though, because it was just too far away from anything. It was way too remote. That's why nobody had even gone there previously. Joseph Whidbey had a different idea. He thought that Australian convicts who had been sent by England to Australia in the epic story of how Australia got it started, once they'd finished their sentences, they could either stay in Australia or they could come up to Puget Sound in the Salish Sea in an area of very fertile grounds, but far away from anybody else, and kind of live out their lives without disturbing good and proper people. Vancouver himself wrote these words, and I use them to close my presentation this evening. And they reflect that he was a man of his own time and his own understanding as a naval officer. Vancouver writes, "To describe the beauties of this region will, on some future occasion, be a very grateful task to the pen of a skillful panegyrist," means a writer. "The serenity of the climate, the innumerable pleasing landscapes, and the abundant fertility that unassisted nature puts forth require only to be enriched by the industry of man with villages and mansions, cottages, and other buildings to render it the most lovely country that can be imagined, whilst the labor of the inhabitants would be amply rewarded in the bounties which nature seems ready to bestow. So thank you very much for your attending, and we will be moving soon then to a time of questions and answers.
All right. Well, thank you, Cyrus. That was a wonderful lecture, beautifully illustrated. Where did you get those? That's my question.
Where did we get them? Actually, this was a project of Bruce and mine, and we Googled and looked for stuff that would expand and still, retain focus. There were there were a whole series of paintings done by a couple of artists, and many of those paintings is what we put in this presentation.
Well, they're absolutely wonderful. I do have some questions from our audience. The first one is, how or why did the Salish dogs become extinct?
Not sure why. Probably because the people that owned them were eventually died out themselves, probably because of the illnesses, because of the plagues and epidemics that went through. But I don't know exactly why. The photograph that showed of the dog is the last known photograph of one of the Salish dogs.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I was wondering how old that photograph was.
Don't know exactly when that was taken. Probably during the 20th century at some point, maybe. The dogs, I have no idea really how long they survived. Dogs were raised like that by native tribes all over North America.
Let's see here. I have a question from Sandra Butterfield. She asks, who named Discovery Bay?
Who named Discovery Bay?
Correct.
Captain Vancouver did. It was really originally named by one of the Spanish, Quadra Bay, after a well-known Spanish mariner and explorer. But Vancouver, when he arrived, when he worked in the area, renamed a lot of things and gave them English names, usually of people that he had known in the British Navy, friends and fellow officers in the Navy. Discovery Bay is one of those names.
Okay. We have another question. Did they encounter Orca at all?
Did they encounter what?
From Denise Dennis, we have, did they encounter orcas at all?
Oh, orcas. Not that there were descriptions. They said that there were large animals, whales in the waters in a few places. I don't think they encountered very many of them, actually. They encountered a lot of other sea life, but I don't remember, and I've read both journals here fairly thoroughly. There may be descriptions, and I just was not picking up on it as I went by.
All right. Susie Murphy asks, can you explain, please, which areas are officially considered the Salish Sea and the Puget Sound? It sounded like originally Puget Sound was actually what we now consider the South Sound.
Yes. What happened was that the whole area was originally named by Captain George Vancouver Admiralty Inlet. And then after all of the explorations and that quote that I shared with you, as they were leaving the area on May 29th, that's when Vancouver named Vashon Island and named Puget Sound. The name Puget Sound then applied to the area of the sound south of the Tacoma Narrows. And it was that way for a long time, but over time, eventually the entire area took on the name of Puget Sound, not Puget's Sound, but Puget Sound. It was a kind of slow morphing and change of name with usage over the decades.
All right. Well, we've got plenty of thank you, Cyrus. Very interesting. And I thank you too.
Well, thank you. It's an enjoyable talk to have prepared, and there are some great stories that could be expanded on at some point that we just didn't have time to even touch or only touch on, rather than tell the stories in their graphic wonderfulness. So.
Thank you, Cyrus. This was a wonderful presentation and a beautiful presentation, as Chris pointed out. And we want to thank everybody who joined us this evening. This presentation is recorded and it will be on our website for everyone to see by early next week. So thank you all, and we'll say good night.
Good night.